Hi, this is Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back. It's my great pleasure to be interviewing Dr. Gary Fettke. Dr. Fettke has been talking about low-carb diets, keto diets for a long time.
How did I get into low carb? Look, I think like many, I mean, not I know your story, but mine was my own personal story. So it's quite a selfish one. So I was a fat kid, but again, if you look at today's children, I wasn't. But at the time, when you look at the old school swimming photographs, I was overweight. I was a good swimmer, good sport, but my mum had me on diets when I was, 10. I can still remember the Israeli diet, which was, eating apples all day, but so she was trying to get my weight under control. I wasn't hugely fat, but I was just, overweight by today's standards. And I took that all the way through life. So again, in retrospect, if I go back 15 years, I was obese. I was 40 odd pounds heavier than where I am now. I did have high blood pressure. I was pre-diabetic. My waist circumference was up, and I was trying to do the right thing by myself, which was, I thought, okay, I need to, I'm going to eat by the food pyramid now. And it didn't work, so I'm just going to exercise more and sure, I'd have a bit of chocolate here, but, I was actually eating pretty well by the food pyramid and putting on weight. And I've got a term, I think you may have heard it, where I say, look, if you eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid. And along the way, you're going to look like the food pyramid. It's that triangular shape. And so the US food pyramid is literally, it is everywhere. And, that's the history of, I'll come back to how I kept going. So effectively, I then had a tumor at the base of my brain 24 years ago now. And I was eating badly. I was on chemotherapy. I was trying to do the right thing. Nothing was working. And then I heard about metformin in the management of cancer, which was really new stuff 14, 15 years ago. And that if people that had aggressive cancers did better if they were on metformin. That work came out of South America, because the guy who was forgotten his name, can't remember, who was trying to actually push it in the US was getting, parlayed off to the side. And so the metformin story rang some bells for me. So hang on, metformin's about reducing sugar. Cancer sort of probably needs some sugar. Why don't we just reduce sugar rather than having a drug? I mean, that's really simplistic sort of stuff. And then I started reading about sugar. And in my practice, like most doctors' practices, we're just assaulted by this tsunami of obesity, metabolic syndrome, poor health, poor immunity, poorer outcomes than we used to have. And particularly in my practice, where I was looking after most of the diabetic foot complications in northern Tasmania, I was, where I used to see the occasional patient, all of a sudden it just became the clinic was just being overrun. Running's a funny word to turn there, but just overwhelmed by the number of people with diabetic foot complications. And, there was, I can still remember when I was starting to talk about sugar, I had one fellow in his 40s that he was at risk of, had him in hospital, and he was at risk of losing his limbs, his lower limbs. And ultimately he lost one leg and part of his other foot. And I can still remember in hospital with him out of control blood sugar levels, and he was eating ice cream. And I said, how, literally I was just gobsmacked about, why are you eating ice cream? He said, well, they told me I can. And in fact, if you actually go through the hospital food guidelines here in Australia and you take them apart, it is recommended for people with type 2 diabetes to be having the option of having ice cream 3 times a day, plus carbs for breakfast, carbs for lunch, carbs for dinner, carbs for morning tea, carbs for afternoon tea, carbs for supper, which is a massive glucose load of which the body can't handle it. And hopefully most people never get to operate on people with diabetic problems and foot problems in particular. But, and I have mentioned the time when I'm operating and you've got to amputate someone's leg. It's just horrible. It's not a decision that's made overnight. It's a journey. You might lose a bit of, and when you do,
typically from infection, right? Or neuropathy, you don't feel the toe, you get infection, and then there's infection in the bone, right? You wouldn't just take off the leg because someone has diabetes, right? There's this.
No. It's because of the long-term complications. And, I describe those. The microvascular disease is where every single vessel becomes narrowed. Every single bit of tissue loses its oxygen supply or has a diminished oxygen supply. The nerves aren't working properly, so they can't feel it properly. And then all of a sudden you get a little crack in the skin, or you stub your toe and some bugs get into that. And A, they don't feel it. B, their ability to heal it is diminished dramatically. And then it starts setting off. And they've often got diets which are spiking their blood glucoses all over the place. Their diets are often low in protein. They're often low in micronutrients. They don't get healthy fats in. And all of a sudden, it's this ongoing slow degradation process. But the same process is happening in the foot. It's happening in the kidneys. It's happening in the eyes. It's happening in the brains. The medical profession tell the patients, their HbA1c is, it's 7, or it's 7.5, or it's 8. You've got good control. Well, that's complete nonsense. They do not have good control. We know, and HbA1c is a measure of blood glucose control over the previous few months based on the glycation of the red blood cells in the body, but it's called the HbA1c, as you know. And you're diagnosed at a HbA1c of 6.5 that you've got diabetes. Well, I sort of jokingly say, what happens at 6.499? You don't have diabetes. But what's interesting is that the complications of diabetes, the microvasculars, the cardiovascular disease, the strokes, go up above a HbA1c of 5.7.
Yeah.
So 5.7 is not, you wouldn't even be called, you wouldn't have diabetes. So having a HbA1c of 7, to me, is not control at all. Having a HbA1c of 6.5 is not control. 6 isn't control. Yeah. You want a HbA1c of 5.7 or less.
Well, why would you take off someone's toe or someone's leg?
Because they're failing. So these people are having daily dressings. They're coming along. They've got low-grade infection, and then it becomes a greater infection. Antibiotics are given, but antibiotics can't reach it because of the blood supply issues. It doesn't matter how many supplies you've got. If you don't have a transport system to get to the destination, it doesn't matter. So antibiotics are poorly effective. I tried prescribing, literally for my patients to be given cheese and eggs in hospital. I had to write it on the chart just so they got protein. But when the infection gets out of control, then it starts ascending. So instead of being the toe, it's becoming the front of the foot. It's not the front of the foot, it's the back of the foot. It's not the back of the foot, it's up to the calf. And if you don't control the calf, then it's at the thigh, and then you die.
That cascade of events and leading to blood infection, sepsis, can kill you. So basically,
not can kill you. It does.
If you're saving the life of someone by taking off their toe or their leg, that's a brilliant. You saved lives. Why weren't?
I think we prolonged them, and that's just it. But because once you have a leg amputation, your average, your life expectancy is less than 2 years. An amputation for diabetic foot, diabetic foot or diabetic leg amputation, your average life expectancy is less than 2 years. But it's really, I think, very descriptive for diabetes. It's called the Maillard reaction, Maillard. Everyone knows it. It's the browning of food. So you can, every time you go to a bakehouse, you can see that tan brown color on the top of your bread, or the cakes and the croissants and whatever. But essentially that's diabetes. And what I'm talking about is that what happens when you're cooking food is that under the effect of heat, the protein combines with the glucose, the glycation of the protein, and that creates the browning. And that's a fairly simplistic way of looking at it, but it's the caramelization of food. Now, exactly the same process happens in the body. When your blood glucose goes up, your tissue glucose, because of osmotic pressure, goes up by about 2/3 to 3/4 of what it is in the blood. And under the effect of body heat, that glucose in the tissue combines with the protein in the tissue, and you get the Maillard reaction. So every time your blood glucose spikes above normal, every time you are effectively toasting every single tissue in your body. And it doesn't matter. It could be your eyes, your kidneys, your feet, your vessels, your brain. Every single corner of the body is affected by the Maillard reaction. And I've pointed that out to endocrinologists, and they've gone, oh, hadn't thought about it like that. And I said, well, start thinking about it like that and start describing it like that. Because until you get blood glucose control and a steady state, then you have got no chance of turning this person's diabetes around, and certainly no chance of turning their complications around. The guidelines were, you have to give all these carbs to people. I said, well, no, it's making them worse. So one of the challenges that was thrown down to me early on, I said, well, Dr. Fettke, if you've got a problem with it, you have to change the guidelines from Tasmania. And we can go on to the fact that, yes, we, up yours, okay, we're going to do it. So, in the last couple of years, but just in the last few months, we've had some massive wins. We, not just me, but we have changed the guidelines. And that was one of our endpoints, is that Belinda and I have often spoken about. One of the endpoint is when we can have low carb seen as an acceptable option for those people that wish to do it, and that they are supported in the management of low carb in their health, well-being, but particularly in type 2 diabetes. We've gotten to that goalpost. We've done that. So if someone, and you can go to a restaurant, particularly around here in Tasmania, and people say, oh, look, I'd like a low carb option. And you're not looked at as though you're from a different planet. We've now got it across the line. Here in Australia, you can buy low carb beer. Now, there's several brands. So Australia, beer drinking, country in the world, you can buy low carb beer. You can buy low carb cookbooks at the standard stores. So low carb keto cookbooks. So, but then I started challenging the system. I said, okay, I'd like my patients to not be given, and in raw terms, a low carb option. Stop giving them so much sugar. Give them some protein for breakfast. I want an egg on, and I actually used to write it on a chart. I'd prescribe an egg because I couldn't get it through the hospital. So I'd prescribe a piece of cheese. This is ridiculous. I'm prescribing a full-fat yogurt rather than a sugar-filled yogurt. That were the three radical changes I wanted to do in the hospital. Anyway, as it turned out, that was upsetting the dietitians because that was their turf. And I also got on this thing called social media. And I can still remember Belinda and our daughter putting me on social media in crossover in San Francisco. I still remember the table, actually. We saw it again a few years later. I said, that's the table where you ruined my life. Anyway, so within 48 hours of being on social media, I was targeted by someone who was working for Coca-Cola at the time. Within months of me taking it on with the hospital system, the dietitians started taking it up with their parent body, and they wanted me to be silenced about it. As it turned out, I ended up being reported to the medical board on 3 occasions for giving inappropriate advice outside of my clinical scope. One of those times, I got reported involved inappropriately reversing someone's type 2 diabetes on national TV. It was inappropriate that I was doing that. And, okay, he only lost, 30 pounds, 15 kilos. He only came off 6 medications in 12 weeks. And he was feeling, happier and healthier, and that was incredibly dangerous. But again, it was an orthopedic surgeon talking about it. So if you're a celebrity chef or you were someone doing it, then you can be hammered down in the press. But I was an orthopedic surgeon, and my primary aim was to stop amputating limbs, and that had a certain resonance. But there's this whole field of non-science out there which has determined what our guidelines are. And as it turns out, we have the internal emails, and these have been presented to Senate inquiries from the breakfast cereal industry here in Australia. The Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturing Forum was sitting down every 3 months at a golf club talking about tactics, and the minutes said cereal sales in Australia and New Zealand are down. The concepts of low carb and paleo at the time are responsible, and these 7 people are to be targeted. And I was the only Australian doctor on that list. And there was a contractual agreement between the breakfast cereal industry and the Dietitians Association. Only one contract that they ever had was to, in fact, promote and continue to promote the benefits of sugar and cereal to the Australian population. And they were the ones that were involved in the targeting. Now, as it turned out, dietitians were the ones doing the reporting to the medical board. We've got the email chain. We've got the email receipts for the money being paid. And this is not just about me. This is about, very clearly, profits are down for the breakfast cereal industry. We've got them on sugar. We've got them on carbs now. Their last bastion of survival is to keep telling us about the benefits of fibre. So how did we get to this belief? So long and short, October 23, 1917 was the formation of the American Dietetics Association. It started primarily with the work by a woman by the name of Leonard Cooper, who was the first dietitian for the American Defense Department. She wrote the textbooks for the next 30 to 40 years of dietetics, which then got extrapolated into the textbooks for the world. But her conflict of interest was that she'd been working with John Harvey Kellogg, his protege, and the breakfast cereal industry. And here's a little fact for you. Bloom's only found it out recently. I think I'm allowed to tell. But at the very first meeting in 1917, with only a few weeks' notice, there were 6 food producers, food industry, processed food industry companies at that meeting advertising, at the very first one. And then that's continued on. So we can look at nutrition reviews, which was started by the food industry and, the finance. We can look at Harvard T.C. Chan School of Public Health. All of these schools are heavily funded by the food industry to look at the science. And if you go back over time, I get it that the food industry were trying to make their food more palatable. That's called the bliss point, get the right amount of fat and sugar in it. They were looking at making their product have greater shelf life.
It's good business.
It was called profit. Somewhere in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we started believing that the nutrition science was medical science, and it was given the same weight. And it's not. It was actually about profitability for the food industry. It had nothing to do with health outcomes for the population. And it just got this crossover, this grace, which became generational education. Salt's bad, carbs are good, fat's bad, cholesterol bad, eggs good, bad. It's not based on science. It was based about profit. So that's the profitability aspect of our nutritional education, and how the textbooks were written pretty well by the breakfast cereal industry right from the outset. But again, if you've got to go back in history to work out why they believed that, why was breakfast cereal invented? And some people find this a bit challenging, but John Harvey Kellogg invented breakfast cereal to stop everyone from masturbating, because
reduce the male libido.
Both male and female. So his work at the Battle Creek, Michigan, the modern day hospital is a result of John Harvey Kellogg. The Battle Creek, Michigan, that structure which we're all part of in Western society, big buildings, multiple levels, multiple specialties coming together into the one space, and having this sort of vertical and horizontal integration, is a concept started by John Harvey Kellogg. He was brilliant. He had multiple food patents. Over 100 patents. Back in the temperance movement times, there was a time when people were moving from there wasn't enough work in the bush, so they were moving to the cities. The men would move to the cities. There was poor sanitation, so therefore the water wasn't good. So therefore there was drinking of a low alcohol food, the mead, the low alcohol beer. So as a result of that beer, everyone was I'm going back and I'm time traveling. I'm creating a picture where people were slightly drunk. Their libido was on, in action. There was infidelity, and the temperance movement at that time was going, hang on, we need to clean our acts up here. Stop drinking alcohol. Let's go for pure living, pure food. But at the same time, meat, they couldn't get fresh meat into the city. So what meat that had been produced on the land was being salted to try and bring it into the city, and the salt didn't work fully. So all of a sudden we've got a demonization of meat because it's putrid, but we started having this thought that there's a demonization of salt as well. It's got nothing to do with salt being bad. It just happened to be that it wasn't quite good enough for preserving the meat. We've got this thing called refrigeration now. But we try and go back in history to try and work out why do we believe that fat's bad? Why do we believe that meat's bad? Why do we believe that salt's bad? But guess what? Over time, we've had meat causes cancer, meat causes violence, meat causes, all these animalistic attitudes. Meat is bad.